On a quiet stretch of land outside Westfield, Indiana, there is an 18-acre property where the ground refuses to give up everything it knows. For decades, it looked ordinary. A large suburban home, a long gravel driveway, trees thick enough to block the view from the road. Children once played there. Horses once grazed nearby. Neighbors waved as they passed. But beneath the soil, scattered across wooded ravines and shallow depressions, investigators have now recovered more than 10,000 bone fragments. They belong to men who vanished in the early 1990s, men whose names were whispered in bars, men whose disappearances were initially dismissed. And while authorities once believed there were 11 victims, modern forensic work suggests the number is at least 25, possibly more. The suspected killer was a successful businessman, a father, a church-going suburban homeowner. His name was Herbert Herb Baumeister. He was never arrested, he was never tried, and he was never forced to answer for what investigators believe he did. Because in July 1996, just as police were preparing a warrant, Baumeister fled the country and died by suicide in a Canadian provincial park. But the story didn't end with his death. In fact, it may only now be fully beginning. Because in 2025, investigators returned to Fox Hollow Farm again, still finding fragments, still identifying victims, still asking the same question they asked 30 years ago. How did this happen in plain sight for so long? And how many men never made it home? Fox Hollow Farm sat just north of Indianapolis in Hamilton County, one of the fastest-growing and most affluent areas in Indiana during the late 1980s and early 1990s. This was not a forgotten rural hollow. It was suburban America expanding outward, new developments, good schools, stable property values, a place where people believed danger came from elsewhere. The Baumeister property itself was large, even by local standards, 18 acres, dense woods along the perimeter, rolling ground that dipped and rose, obscuring sight lines. From the road, you could barely see the house. That isolation was considered a luxury. In the early 1990s, the Midwest was in a moment of cultural contradiction, economically stable, socially conservative, and deeply uncomfortable with conversations about sexuality, especially homosexuality. Indianapolis had a small but vibrant gay nightlife scene. Bars served as social hubs, safe spaces, and for many men, one of the few places they could be openly themselves. But they were also places where people disappeared, quietly. No crime scenes, no witnesses, no bodies, just absence. Herbert Richard Baumeister did not look like a predator. He was married, he had children, he ran a successful thrift store chain business. Neighbors described him as odd, not dangerous. He laughed at inappropriate moments. He staged mannequins in strange poses around his property. He avoided confrontation. But nothing about him triggered alarm. This was part of the danger. Baumeister moved through life wearing what investigators later described as a perfectly plausible mask. Fox Hollow Farm was not just a home, it was controlled space. Baumeister could choose who entered, who stayed, and who was never seen again. Investigators believe he lured young gay men from Indianapolis bars by offering drinks, companionship, and privacy, something many could not safely find elsewhere. Once on the property, the world narrowed. No neighbors close enough to hear, no reason for guests to be expected, no immediate urgency if someone didn't return. At first, they were not called victims, they were called missing. Men like Daniel Thomas Halloran, Jeffrey Allen Jones, Alan Lee Livingston, and Manuel Resendez. Others whose names were never reported, never connected, never searched for with urgency. Some families filed reports, some didn't, fearing exposure, stigma, or disbelief. In the early 1990s, missing gay men did not generate headlines, they generated silence. The case didn't begin with bones, it began with patterns. Men seen leaving bars with the same man, cars left abandoned, stories that didn't quite align, and eventually a tip, one that led police to Fox Hollow Farm. What they found would take decades to fully surface. Herbert Richard Baumeister did not look like a predator. He was married. He had children. He ran a successful thrift store business chain. Neighbors described him as odd, not dangerous. He laughed at inappropriate moments. He staged mannequins in strange poses around his property. He avoided confrontation, but nothing about him triggered alarm. This was part of the danger. Baumeister moved through life wearing what investigators later described as a perfectly plausible mask. Fox Hollow Farm was not just a home, it was controlled space. Baumeister could choose who entered, who stayed, and who was never seen again. Investigators believe he lured young gay men from Indianapolis bars by offering drinks, companionship, and privacy, something many could not safely find elsewhere. Once on the property, the world narrowed. No neighbors close enough to hear. No reason for guests to be expected. No immediate urgency if someone didn't return. At first, they were not called victims. They were called missing. Men like Daniel Thomas Halloran, Jeffrey Allen Jones, Alan Lee Livingston, Manuel Resendez. Others whose names were never reported, never connected, never searched for with urgency. Some families filed reports, some didn't, fearing exposure, stigma, or disbelief. In the early 1990s, missing gay men did not generate headlines. They generated silence. The case didn't begin with bones. It began with patterns. Men seen leaving bars with the same man, cars left abandoned, stories that didn't quite align, and eventually a tip, one that led police to Fox Hollow Farm. What they found would take decades to fully surface. By the early 1990s, Indianapolis police had a problem they didn't yet know how to name. Young men were disappearing. Not in clusters large enough to trigger panic, not in ways that produced bodies or obvious crime scenes, just gone. Some vanished after nights out, some after leaving bars with someone they'd just met. Some simply stopped calling home. At first, the cases lived in separate files, different precincts, different detectives, different assumptions. Many of the missing men were gay. Some were not publicly out. Others had strained relationships with their families. A few were assumed to have simply left town, a conclusion that required no investigation and no uncomfortable questions. It took time for anyone to notice that the stories shared a shape. Witnesses described the same man at multiple bars, a quiet, well-dressed older man, friendly, non-threatening, driving a nice car. He offered drinks. He offered conversation. Sometimes he offered an after-party at his home north of the city. That man was Herbert Baumeister, but at the time his name meant nothing. The first direct link between Baumeister and a disappearance came through survival, not death. In 1994, a man reported that he had gone home with Baumeister after meeting him at a bar. According to later accounts, once inside the house at Fox Hollow Farm, something changed. The mood shifted. Baumeister's behavior became erratic. The man sensed danger. He managed to leave. That report, vague, uncomfortable, and easy to minimize, was one of the first times law enforcement seriously considered Baumeister as a suspect. But suspicion is not evidence, and Fox Hollow Farm did not look like a crime scene. It looked like a large, eccentric home. When officers first visited the property, Baumeister was cooperative, to a point. He answered questions. He allowed limited access. He explained away oddities. Mannequins posed in unsettling ways? Art projects. Strange behaviors? Just my personality. No blood, no witnesses, no bodies. The ground remained untouched. In 1995, with pressure slowly building, investigators returned to Fox Hollow Farm with permission to search parts of the property. What they expected to find, if anything, was unclear. What they did not expect was bone. Scattered, weathered, fragmented. Small pieces at first, easily mistaken for animal remains. Indiana is rich with wildlife. Bones in wooded areas are not uncommon. But these were different. Some were unmistakably human. The discovery forced a shift. Fox Hollow Farm was no longer just a possible lead, it was a potential burial ground. What investigators encountered almost immediately was a problem of scale. The property was vast. The wooded areas were dense. The terrain dipped and folded in ways that hid remains easily. There were no obvious graves, no centralized dumping site. Instead, bone fragments appeared scattered, suggesting dismemberment, movement, and time. Search teams did what they could with the tools available in the mid-1990s: cadaver dogs, manual excavation, visual sweeps. But forensic technology was limited. DNA testing was expensive, slow, and far less precise than it would become decades later. Many fragments were too degraded to identify. Investigators collected what they could, and then, crucially, they stopped. Looking back, modern investigators have identified multiple reasons the original investigation failed to fully expose the scope of what happened at Fox Hollow Farm. Many of the missing men were gay at a time when law enforcement often treated their disappearances as lower priority. There was stigma, there was discomfort, there was bias, sometimes unspoken, sometimes explicit. Families were hesitant to push. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. Silence filled the gaps. Fox Hollow Farm did not resemble known serial killer sites of the era. No confined basement, no obvious torture room, no single dumping ground. The killings, as investigators now believe, were spread over time, with remains disposed of incrementally. This made pattern recognition difficult. Herb Baumeister did not match the popular image of a serial killer. He was wealthy, married, a father. He did not live on society's margins. That mattered. By June 1996, pressure was mounting. Investigators were preparing a warrant. Baumeister knew it. Before police could act, he fled. He left the United States quietly and drove north into Canada. On July 3, 1996, his body was found in Pinery Provincial Park, Ontario. He had died by suicide. No note addressed the murders, no confession, no explanation, just absence, again. With Baumeister dead, the case stalled almost completely. Fox Hollow Farm went quiet. The ground kept its secrets. For years, the case lived in partial memory. Bones were catalogued. Victims remained unidentified. Families waited, or stopped waiting. The property changed hands. Trees grew. Time passed. And for a long while, it seemed that Fox Hollow Farm would remain one of those cases that never quite resolved, another unfinished story of the 1990s. But the ground was not finished speaking. In the 2020s, forensic science caught up with Fox Hollow Farm. Advanced DNA testing, forensic genealogy, renewed public interest. Investigators returned, and this time they dug deeper. By 2025, authorities had recovered approximately 10,000 bone fragments, making Fox Hollow Farm one of the largest collections of unidentified human remains in U.S. history. Victims began to get their names back. Alan Lee Livingston, identified 2023. Jeffrey Allen Jones, identified 2024. Daniel Thomas Halloran, identified 2025. Each identification reopened old wounds and answered questions families had lived with for decades. And investigators now believe the number of victims is at least 25, possibly more. Herb Baumeister died without facing trial, but the story did not end with him, because Fox Hollow Farm is not just about one man. It is about who is believed, who is protected, and who disappears quietly when systems fail. As investigators returned to the property again in late 2025, they were not just looking for bones, they were looking for answers. And they were asking a question that should have been asked much earlier. How many men were taken here, and how many were ignored while it was happening? When investigators returned to Fox Hollow Farm decades later, they weren't just cataloging bones, they were reconstructing behavior. Modern analysis of witness statements, timelines, and surviving records revealed a pattern that had been nearly invisible in the early 1990s, not because it wasn't there, but because no one was looking for it. The men who disappeared shared quiet similarities. They were young or middle-aged. They frequented the same Indianapolis bars. They were last seen with a man who appeared safe. They vanished without struggle, without witnesses, without scenes of chaos. This was not random violence, it was controlled selection. Investigators now believe Baumeister hunted patiently, sometimes waiting weeks or months between killings. He did not rush, he did not escalate publicly. He blended back into ordinary life between murders. That patience may be the most disturbing element of all. By day, Herb Baumeister lived the life many people wanted. He ran Save-A-Lot Thrift, a successful chain of resale stores. He attended school events. He lived in a large home in a desirable county. Neighbors saw him mowing his lawn, hosting gatherings, walking the property. He was not invisible. He was accepted. Baumeister's marriage was strained, but not publicly explosive. His wife and children spent significant time away from the Fox Hollow Farm property, a detail investigators later viewed as critical. Privacy came easily to him. At night, particularly on weekends, Herb Baumeister's life shifted. Indianapolis's gay bar scene in the early 1990s was relatively small. Regulars noticed familiar faces. That familiarity created a sense of safety. Baumeister didn't force himself into spaces. He waited. He talked. He listened. He learned. Witnesses described him as awkward but polite, attentive without being aggressive. He dressed well. He drove a nice car. He didn't fit the stereotype of danger. And that mattered. Because when men left bars with Baumeister, they didn't believe they were entering risk. They believed they were entering privacy. Fox Hollow Farm was not chosen by accident. The property offered isolation without suspicion. 18 acres meant no close neighbors, no reason for passers-by, no immediate accountability. Once inside the gate, guests entered Baumeister's world. Investigators believe Baumeister used the house's layout and the surrounding woods to separate acts from consequences, keeping violence away from public view and dispersing remains in ways that delayed discovery. There were no mass graves, instead fragments, pieces scattered over time. This fragmentation wasn't just physical, it erased victims from the narrative. What happened inside Fox Hollow Farm remains partially unknowable. Baumeister did not confess. No surviving witnesses saw the final moments. Investigators have reconstructed events based on bone condition, survivor testimony, behavioral patterns, and statements from acquaintances. What they avoid now, intentionally, is speculation, because this case does not need embellishment. The evidence already tells a clear story of intentional killing, followed by dismemberment and deliberate dispersal of remains. This was not impulsive violence, it was ritualized control. Modern investigators emphasize one thing above all else. These were not anonymous victims. They were men with lives, interrupted. Daniel Thomas Holleran, identified 2025. Daniel was remembered as kind, social, and reliable. His disappearance left unanswered questions for decades. His identification in 2025 finally gave his family certainty, but not closure. Jeffrey Allen Jones, identified 2024. Jeffrey's identification reopened a case thought lost to time. Friends remembered his laugh. His absence had never been explained until it was. Alan Lee Livingston, identified 2023. Alan's case was among the first to benefit from forensic genealogy. His name restored what time had taken. Others followed. Manuel Resendez, Johnny Baer, Richard Douglas Hamilton, Jr., Stephen Sperlin Hale, Alan Wayne Broussard, Roger Allen Goodlett, Michael Frederick Kearn. Each identification did something small but essential. It returned humanity to remains. In 2025, renewed media attention, including a Hulu docuseries, raised uncomfortable questions. Could Herb Baumeister have acted alone? No evidence has confirmed accomplices, but questions remain. How did activity go unnoticed for so long? How were repeated disappearances missed? Who looked away, intentionally or not? Investigators stress caution, but they no longer dismiss the questions outright. Herb Baumeister's suicide ended one investigation. It did not end the truth, because every fragment recovered since has said the same thing. The danger was not hidden, it was unexamined. When investigators and journalists revisit the Fox Hollow Farm case today, one question dominates every discussion. How did this go on for years? The uncomfortable answer is not singular, it is layered. And none of those layers involve brilliance or criminal genius. Herb Baumeister was not smarter than the system. He was benefiting from its blind spots. In the early 1990s, missing person investigations depended heavily on who was missing. Men who disappeared without signs of violence were often assumed to have left voluntarily. This assumption was applied even more aggressively when the missing person was gay, estranged from family, transient between cities, living outside traditional domestic structures. Many of Baumeister's victims fit at least one of these categories. Reports were delayed, follow-ups were minimal, cases remained open in name only. No centralized system existed to connect disappearances across jurisdictions in real time. Each missing man was treated as an isolated event. Several investigators involved in the original case later admitted something quietly but honestly. At the time, they did not believe a serial killer was targeting gay men in Indianapolis. This was not based on evidence, it was based on assumption. Gay men were often viewed as adults who took risks, lived unconventional lives, moved frequently. Disappearance did not equal danger in the eyes of the system. That belief allowed a predator to operate without scrutiny. To understand Fox Hollow Farm, it is impossible to separate it from the cultural climate of the early 1990s. This was a time when homosexuality was still widely stigmatized. AIDS-related fear dominated public perception. Many gay men lived double lives. Bars were more than nightlife, they were refuge. But they were also one of the few places where people were visible and therefore vulnerable. Victims often hesitated to involve police when friends disappeared. Families hesitated to push investigations that might expose private lives. Silence did not come from apathy, it came from fear, and Baumeister understood that instinctively. Modern investigators have identified multiple moments where the Fox Hollow Farm killings could have ended earlier. 1. The survivor's report. The man who escaped Fox Hollow Farm after sensing danger provided a critical early warning. But without physical evidence or corroboration, the report stalled. It was treated as suspicious behavior, not attempted homicide. The first bones. When bone fragments were first discovered, the scale was misunderstood. Some remains were misclassified as animal. Others were logged but not aggressively followed. The idea that a wealthy suburban homeowner might be responsible felt implausible to many involved. The lack of pressure. Baumeister was cooperative enough. He allowed limited searches. He answered questions. He did not panic. That calm created doubt. Investigators often expect resistance from guilty parties. Baumeister did not resist. He waited. When Baumeister fled to Canada in 1996, many investigators interpreted the act as what it functionally was, a confession without words. In Pinery Provincial Park, his death by suicide closed the legal case, but left every other question open. Why no note? Why no explanation? Some believe Baumeister wanted control until the very end, including control over the narrative. By dying without speaking, he denied motive, count, method, and acknowledgement of victims. The silence continued. For years after Baumeister's death, Fox Hollow Farm sat quietly. Bones were stored, files gathered dust, families aged without answers. But the ground had not finished telling its story. Each fragment recovered later revealed something the original investigation missed. This was not an isolated spree. It was sustained behavior over time. By the 2020s, law enforcement began looking at Fox Hollow Farm differently, not as a cold case, but as an incomplete one. The question was no longer, who did this? It was, how much did we miss? And that question reframed everything. As DNA restored names to remains, something else changed. Public language shifted. These men were no longer described as at risk, transient, high-risk lifestyle. They were described as sons, brothers, friends, co-workers. The system had failed to see them clearly. Now, belatedly, it was forced to. Herb Baumeister did not succeed because he was invisible. He succeeded because the people he targeted were. Fox Hollow Farm is not just a story about murder. It is a story about whose absence matters, whose fear is dismissed, and how silence can function as protection. By the time the system caught up, Baumeister was already gone. But the truth was not. It was waiting in the soil. For nearly 2 decades after Herb Baumeister's death, Fox Hollow Farm existed in a strange state of suspension. The property was known, the bones were known, the killer was known, at least in name, but the case itself was considered functionally closed. There was no suspect to prosecute, no confession to extract, no urgency in reopening wounds that many believed would never heal. That changed slowly, and then all at once. By the late 2010s, advances in forensic science had transformed what was possible. DNA could now be recovered from fragments once thought useless. Forensic genealogy could build identities from distant relatives with consent and legal oversight. This approach had already solved dozens of cold cases nationwide. Fox Hollow Farm was a prime candidate, but it was also one of the most challenging. Many fragments were small, many were degraded, many had been exposed to the elements for years. Progress was slow, painfully slow, but then it began to work. In 2023, authorities announced the identification of Alan Lee Livingston. For decades, Livingston's disappearance had been unresolved. His family lived with uncertainty, no confirmation, no remains, no answers. The DNA match changed that. It did not erase the loss, but it replaced uncertainty with truth. Livingston became one of the first victims to reclaim his name, and with it, his place in history. Investigators described the moment as both a breakthrough and a burden. Because once one name is restored, the pressure to restore the rest becomes impossible to ignore. In 2024, another identification followed: Jeffrey Allen Jones. Friends remembered him as social, warm, and dependable, a man who disappeared without explanation in the early 1990s. His identification confirmed what many had long feared. Jones had not left voluntarily. He had been taken. For his surviving family members, the announcement reopened grief they had carried quietly for years, but it also ended a long silence. In April 2025, authorities announced the identification of Daniel Thomas Halloran, the most recent victim named at the time of writing. Halloran's identification was the result of years of genealogical research, DNA extraction from degraded material, and painstaking cross-referencing with missing person reports. For investigators, it confirmed something crucial. The process worked. More names could be restored. More families could finally know. But it also reinforced a darker realization. If 3 men had been identified in just a few years, then many more remained unnamed. Early in the investigation, Fox Hollow Farm was linked to approximately 11 victims. That number now appears dangerously low. Based on the volume of remains, overlapping bone fragments, and forensic analysis, investigators believe the true number is at least 25. Possibly more. No one can say for certain, and that uncertainty may never disappear. Each identification brings relief and pain. Families must relive loss. Investigators must re-enter trauma. Communities must confront what was ignored. Naming the dead is an act of justice, but it is not a cure. In late 2025, investigators returned to the property yet again. Excavation resumed. Search grids expanded. The work was slow and deliberate, because this time the goal was not just recovery, it was reckoning. For decades, Fox Hollow Farm kept its secrets buried beneath leaves and soil. Now, piece by piece, those secrets are coming back. Not as rumors, not as speculation, but as names. The men who vanished are no longer missing. They are being found, slowly, painfully, but finally. And with every fragment recovered, the story grows clearer. This was not a mystery hidden in darkness. It was a tragedy allowed to unfold in silence.
For years, one of the quiet cruelties of the Fox Hollow Farm case was this: the victims existed only as evidence. Boxes, fragments, case numbers. Their remains were cataloged and stored, but they were not mourned publicly. Not because families didn't care, but because there was nothing to bury, no certainty to anchor grief. That changed as identifications accumulated. In 2024, Hamilton County officials coordinated a joint burial and memorial for victims whose remains had been identified and, in some cases, partially reassembled. It was not a traditional funeral. There were no caskets carried by pallbearers, no single family at the center. Instead, there were names read aloud, slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself could restore something that had been taken. Among them, Alan Lee Livingston, Jeffrey Allen Jones, Manuel Resendez, Johnny Byer, Richard Douglas Hamilton, Jr., Stephen Sperlin Hale, Alan Wayne Broussard, Roger Allen Goodlett, Michael Frederick Kearn, and space left for those still unnamed. A public monument was unveiled the same year, simple, restrained, intentional. It did not focus on the killer. It did not dramatize the violence. It listed the victims. That choice mattered. For families, identification did not arrive as closure. It arrived as finality. Some had spent decades believing their loved one might still be alive, that silence meant escape, not death. DNA ended that possibility. Others had suspected the truth for years and were simply waiting for proof. The responses varied. Some families spoke publicly for the first time, describing brothers who loved music, sons who worked steady jobs, friends who vanished after an ordinary night out. Others chose privacy, declining interviews, declining cameras, declining to relive a loss they had already carried for too long. One theme appeared again and again in statements: we weren't believed. Families described early reports that went nowhere, tips that stalled, calls that were never returned. Not always because of malice, but because their loved ones did not fit the profile of someone authorities expected to be in danger. The memorial did not erase that history, but it acknowledged it. For years, Fox Hollow Farm was covered as a strange but contained case, a disturbing footnote of the 1990s. That framing began to change in the 2020s. As identifications resumed and investigators returned to the property, journalists and documentarians began asking harder questions, not just about Baumeister, but about how the system responded. In 2025, a Hulu docuseries, The Fox Hollow Murders: Playground of a Serial Killer, brought renewed national attention. The series did not focus on sensational detail. Instead, it examined the timeline of disappearances, law enforcement blind spots, cultural stigma surrounding gay victims, and whether opportunities to intervene were missed. It also raised questions, carefully framed, about whether Baumeister truly acted alone or whether indifference and silence functioned as unintentional accomplices. Investigators emphasized that no evidence has confirmed direct accomplices, but the larger question remained: how many people noticed something was wrong and didn't push further? Fox Hollow Farm itself no longer looks like it once did. Ownership has changed, structures have been altered or removed, trees have grown and fallen. To someone passing by, it appears unremarkable, another large property in a growing county. But for investigators, it remains active ground. Searches in late 2025 were conducted with modern mapping, grid excavation, and forensic oversight, slower, more precise, and more respectful than early efforts. Every dig carries uncertainty. Each fragment recovered is both progress and proof of what was missed. Today, Fox Hollow Farm is no longer defined solely by one man. It represents a convergence of failures, cultural stigma, institutional delay, technological limitation, and social silence. It also represents change. Cases once considered unsolvable are now reopened. Victims once dismissed are now named. Families once ignored are now heard. But none of that reverses what happened. It only clarifies it. There is no clean ending to Fox Hollow Farm. There are still unidentified remains. There may be victims whose names are never recovered. There are families who will never know for certain. Justice, in this case, is incomplete by definition, but memory is not. And remembrance, however late, still matters.
In most murder cases, the story ends in a courtroom. Evidence is presented. Arguments are made. A verdict is delivered. Fox Hollow Farm never had that ending. Herb Baumeister was never arrested, never charged, never forced to sit in front of the families of the men investigators believe he killed. When he died by suicide in July 1996, the legal system lost its central figure, and with him, the possibility of a traditional form of justice. For some, that fact alone feels like a failure. But for investigators who returned to the case decades later, Baumeister's death created a different obligation, one not to prosecute, but to document, identify, and restore. Because when the perpetrator is gone, accountability does not disappear. It changes form. In Fox Hollow Farm, justice cannot mean punishment. There is no sentence left to impose, no cell to confine, no confession to extract. Instead, justice has taken quieter shapes, giving victims their names back, correcting the historical record, acknowledging institutional failure, creating permanent public memory. For families, justice has meant being believed, sometimes for the first time. For investigators, it has meant admitting what was missed. For the public, it has meant confronting a truth that is deeply uncomfortable, that this did not happen in secret. It happened within systems that did not act fast enough. If Fox Hollow Farm had a trial, the defendant would not be one man. It would be a set of systems. Police in the early 1990s were not malicious, but they were limited by technology, by culture, and by assumptions. Missing gay men were not treated as urgent cases. Disappearances without violence were deprioritized. Patterns across jurisdictions were not easily shared. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they created space for a predator. Fox Hollow Farm exposed a hierarchy of concern. Some lives triggered alarms, others did not. Many victims lived lives that required privacy for survival. That privacy, essential in one context, became deadly in another. Silence was not consent, but it was exploited. Early coverage of the case was fragmented and cautious. Stories focused on oddity rather than pattern, on eccentricity rather than danger. Only later did the narrative shift, when bones could no longer be ignored. One of the most controversial questions raised in recent years is whether Herb Baumeister truly acted alone. Investigators have stated clearly there is no confirmed evidence of accomplices, but the question persists, not because of proof, but because of scale. 25 victims or more, years of activity, a property used repeatedly. Modern investigators approach this carefully. They emphasize that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but also that speculation must never replace facts. What can be said with certainty is this: Even without accomplices, Baumeister did not operate in a vacuum. Inaction, disbelief, and delay functioned as enablers, not by intent, but by consequence. Today, Fox Hollow Farm is no longer just a crime scene. It is a case study in how predators select victims who are unlikely to be missed, in how systems prioritize some disappearances over others, in how truth can remain literally buried when no one demands it be uncovered. It is also a reminder of what happens when assumptions go unchallenged. The assumption that adults leave voluntarily, the assumption that suburban success equals safety, the assumption that danger looks a certain way. Fox Hollow Farm teaches the opposite. Danger often looks ordinary.
In recent years, investigators and families have worked intentionally to reframe the story, not around Baumeister, but around the men he is believed to have killed. Daniel Thomas Holleran, Jeffrey Allen Jones, Alan Lee Livingston, Manuel Resendez, Johnny Bear, Richard Douglas Hamilton, Jr., Stephen Sperlin Hale, Alan Wayne Broussard, Roger Allen Goodlett, Michael Frederick Kiern, and others still unnamed. They are not footnotes. They are the story. Was Herb Baumeister a serial killer? Yes. Was he also a man shaped by a society that allowed him to hide in plain sight? Also, yes. Both things can be true. That is the most unsettling lesson of Fox Hollow Farm. Evil does not always announce itself. It often waits for permission, implicit, unspoken, granted by neglect and silence. This case asks questions without clean answers. What do we owe the missing? When does skepticism become indifference? How many warnings must be ignored before responsibility shifts? There is no moment where the math balances, no outcome where the losses are repaid. Fox Hollow Farm will never be finished. Investigators may find more remains, families may receive more names, questions may finally get answers or remain open forever. But one thing is certain: these men are no longer invisible. Their names are spoken, their stories are documented, their absence is acknowledged, and that matters. Because the most dangerous thing about Fox Hollow Farm was never the land, it was the belief that no one was paying attention. Like the video? Hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next story. Thanks for watching.